Our next speaker is Lakshmi Venkataraman. She's a lawyer who works as a campaign manager for farm animal protection at Humane Society International India. She recently led India's first roundtable on fish welfare and aquaculture amongst India's leading farm animal protection stakeholders. She leads Humane Society International India's Farm Animal Protection Leadership Program, which is India's first program for leadership and talent development in the farm animal sector. Previously, she has worked at the Federation of Indian Animal Protection Organizations, where she works with government agencies and private stakeholders to minimize human street dog conflict. Thank you, Lakshmi, for being with us today. It would be so nice to learn more about fish welfare and aquaculture in India.
Thank you so much, Lou. Thank you for having me at this wonderful occasion. Hello, everyone. It's really nice to meet you, and I have learned a lot from my fellow panelists already. Let me just, I think I need to be made the host to be able to share my screen. Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, great. So my topic for today is going to be aquaculture in India. But before that, I'd like to just give a short introduction to the work we do at Humane Society International India. So we are an animal protection nonprofit organization, and we do work on a host of different animal protection issues, including companion animal issues, farm animals, wild animals, animals used for testing in laboratories, and also those affected by natural disasters. And we do this through policy interventions, education programs, and on-ground direct interventions as well. And along with Humane Society International and Humane Society of the United States, we form the world's largest animal protection group. I, of course, am representing the Farm Animal Protection Department. And some of the things that we've actually been doing in this space is, of course, the Farm Animal Protection Leadership Program, which is to develop the next generation of leaders for farm animal protection in India. And also the Humane Entrepreneurship Program, which is basically to incubate and mentor plant-based businesses. So that's really the work we do, and I'm so excited to be here today on this occasion of World Aquatic Animal Day. So why is aquaculture in India really important? Well, first of all, it's the world's second largest producer of aquaculture fish after China. And we contribute 6% to the global aquaculture fish production. And it's a hugely important, fishing in general, actually, not just aquaculture, is a hugely important economic activity to India, especially as a poor and developing country. It employs about 15 million people, and most of them fishermen. And it is also a generator of about $3.5 billion of foreign exchange through fish and fish products. So the fish industry in India itself is huge, and we have this long-standing government program called the Blue Revolution, which basically seeks to make this a much bigger industry than it currently is, and to support the livelihoods and nutrition security goals of this industry in India. Per year, as per the 2017-18 census, we have been producing about 12.5 million metric tons of fish, out of which about 50% is contributed through aquaculture. And our yearly aquaculture growth is 6% per annum. And and we're second only to China. And the way the Indian government speaks about it, it seems like they're very ambitious for this sector in India for the reasons I mentioned. So that's really from the economic standpoint about how important it is for India. So the three main types of aquaculture that are practiced in India are freshwater aquaculture, brackish water aquaculture, and mariculture. So freshwater aquaculture is essentially the farming of fish and other aquatic animals in freshwater bodies such as ponds, lakes, rivers, and reservoirs in the inland areas. And about 90% of India's aquaculture farming is done in freshwater aquaculture. So it's really the main place where the government is focused its attention on. And there are only three major species that of the major Indian carp, which are farmed in these facilities. And their local names are Rohu, Mrigal, and Katla. So 95% of India's aquaculture is coming from these facilities and is these three species. So that's a lot of individual fish. So that's freshwater aquaculture. Then brackish water aquaculture is the aquaculture that is practiced in the seas and along the coastline of India. And this is a pretty unexplored area because only 10% of India's coastline is currently being used for this kind of aquaculture. And yeah, so it's still something that is not fully yet on the government's radar, but is sure to be soon. And the third one is actually a sort of offshoot of freshwater aquaculture. It's where a section of the sea is cordoned off and the aquaculture is done there. And so that's again a very unexplored area and is still sort of finding its footing. And the main species that are in each of these types of aquaculture, like I mentioned, for freshwater aquaculture is the major Indian carp, which are Rohu, Katla, and Mrigal, forming 95% of the Indian aquaculture production. And in mariculture, in brackish water aquaculture, you have tiger shrimp and exotic white-leg shrimp, which are the main species. And most of the brackish water aquaculture produce is exported. And the third one under mariculture is mussels, oysters, and clams, but that's not very developed sector yet. So the information I shared till now is largely relevant from an economic standpoint. I mean, this is why the industry is valued from the government standpoint, from the industry standpoint. But one big crucial area that is completely ignored is from the welfare perspective of the fish itself. So just a short brief about the laws on the subject in India. There currently don't exist any legislations for fish welfare specifically. So we have a general animal protection legislation called the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, which covers all animals in theory, but the manner in which it's drafted, there are not too many provisions that could be specifically relevant for fish, but there are some provisions that animal protection groups are exploring about, potentially using them. But it hasn't been done so far. Instead, we have a ton of legislations and regulations to obviously speak about the industry, to maximize productivity, to help farmers that are involved in fish farming, things like that. So when there are no specific laws to even discuss fish welfare or protect fish welfare, there is really no law or regulation to speak which even regulates on the aspect of fish welfare. So what you have essentially is a huge vacuum, a lacuna, where any and all practices allowed. And typically the practices that have been coming up tend to maximize, efficiency for the producer. And that really means seriously and severely compromising on the welfare of the fish, because the welfare of the fish is not even recognized, not even on paper. So some of the key metrics that are used to determine the welfare of fish, I just want to get into that a little bit. So one is stocking density. Now, stocking density refers to the number of fish that can be found in a unit volume of water. And of course, this varies, species wise. But and in India, we have three types of farms: the extensive farms, the semi-intensive farms, and the intensive farms. And the intensive farms have up to like 15,000 fingerlings of fish, carp fish per hectare per year, which is a very high stocking density, which means essentially that there is huge amount of overcrowding. The fish have absolutely no space to move around. There's a lot of cramping. And as a result, the fish aren't really able to even move or swim enough. And they're bumping up against each other. And this leads to a lot of injuries on their scales, on their fins, on their snouts. They aren't really able to escape from predators or even seek a change in temperature when they feel like. So that's a huge welfare concern, and it is only set to become worse as and when we increase the productivity angle of our fish facilities. So that's stocking density. And the next one is water quality management. Some argue that this is the most important welfare metric for fish. And it is the quality of the water and also the dissolved oxygen. And that essentially means the amount of oxygen that is dissolved in a unit volume of water. So sometimes there's completely inadequate oxygen, and this can lead to suffocation, asphyxiation, and even death of the fish. And even the water quality itself is found to be extremely bad in India. And some places, some preliminary reports have suggested that it is as bad as drainage water or sewer water. And the water is contaminated with excrement, fish excrement, parasites, and other contaminants. And this that leads to several diseases amongst the fish, and including skin diseases. And also, when one section of the population of fish get affected by this, then it spreads rampantly amongst the entire fish population in that facility, and then many fish could even die. So water quality is a very big welfare issue in India. And then is handling, transport, and slaughter. So of course, you have to sort of transport the fish from one facility to another facility. And this is based on the need to move them towards slaughter. And of course, there has to be a sort of consistency in the conditions in which the fish is stored in the original facility, and then in the transporting vehicle, and then finally onto slaughter. But that often doesn't happen, and there aren't often too many qualified personnel who know anything at all about fish welfare, who are doing all this handling process. And that is an extremely stressful process for the fish to keep moving around in that way. And of course, the slaughter itself. So the OIE, which is the international governing body for animal health, requires that the best practice for fish includes stunning the fish before slaughter, and the stunning has to be done in a manner so as to cause immediate and irreversible loss of consciousness. And this is simply not what happens. And first of all, stunning barely happens in India. And if it does, it's not always successful. And then you have the animal that is still conscious and writhing in pain for many minutes, sometimes even hours. And they're just tossed. They're just tossed and sort of left there until they die a very painful death. And it's also that fish in India is often sold in open markets. And so they're live there, they're struggling there, and then they're disemboweled. And basically, the absence of slaughter is stunning is a very, very serious welfare concern in India for fish. So I want to get into a little bit about potential fish welfare initiatives and interventions that can be useful in India. I have to state before that fish welfare is not yet a very serious topic, even amongst the farm animal protection groups. So within the mainstream public in India, it's absolutely not even a discussion. There is no consciousness yet on the issue of fish welfare. And that's very natural because we're a developing country, and the concerns there are several, human related concerns that people have. And within animal protection, it's companion animals, and we're only just starting to have a dialogue on farm animal protection in the public space. And it's not yet touched fish welfare yet. So it's the animal protection groups and the farm animal protection groups that are currently just having these preliminary conversations about fish welfare. So some of the potential fish welfare initiatives or interventions are minimum water quality standards. Like I said earlier, the water quality and the amount of dissolved oxygen are crucial to ensuring fish welfare. So, and this is something that this is a standard that sort of intersects between the objectives of animal protection groups and environment protection groups, because the quality of water is definitely an environmental concern, but it's also an animal welfare concern. So this is a space where animal protection and environment groups can crucially intersect and advocate together. And for instance, the and legislations that have that don't really have any animal welfare component at all can also be leveraged for this purpose. For example, we have this legislation called the Water Act, and it does not speak about animal welfare at all. It just has to do with water bodies. But we could potentially advocate for improving water quality through the Water Act. And that would also have a very high impact on incremental impact on fish welfare. So that's that. And the next is research and literature development. Because the sector is so new in India and nascent, there's very little original material or research on the subject that is India specific. So whatever little literature exists is about the economic aspect of the industry or about livelihood, nutrition, and things like that. There's really no material on the welfare aspect in India. And we ourselves at HSI India have had to do fish farm visits to understand the on-ground reality. So there is definitely a significant need for more peer-reviewed research on the subject of fish welfare in India. And that will help us understand the situation more accurately and then move towards policy development. The next is legal initiatives. Like I said, the main animal protection statute in India is called the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, which hasn't so far been used for fish welfare. It for some years now, it has been being used for chickens, which are in the battery cages, for their welfare with limited success. So but this is definitely something that's being explored by animal protection groups. Are there certain provisions? Like, for instance, there's one provision which talks about overcrowding and intensive confinement, and that not being legal. So we could creatively interpret that to also speak out against high stocking densities in fish farms. Then government initiatives, because the government plays such a huge role in maximizing output for fish production, there is also a great scope for involving government agencies in the regulation of fish farms in a way that somewhat incrementally increases fish welfare. For instance, government involvement in capacity building programs for fish farmers, education for them on what even constitutes fish welfare. This currently doesn't exist. Or resources for providing stunning equipment for these fish farmers so that fish can be stunned prior to slaughter. Or devices that help read the water quality of a particular farm. That could really be helpful for the farmers to maintain that ensure that their farms have a certain minimum water quality standard. So these are some of the ways in which we can involve the government bodies. And the last is private policy. So this is something that is currently being explored in the West through corporate outreach programs where they work with food businesses, retailers to ensure that they are only purchasing a certain standard of fish that have a certain basic standard of welfare. We haven't yet gotten to that stage in India because there isn't sufficient consciousness around the issue, but definitely working with financial institutions, because all the big farms today, fish farms in India, are most certainly getting loans for their facilities and their whole operations essentially from public sector banks. So potentially working with those financial institutions to incentivize higher welfare fish farms is an area that we are thinking about. And the second is working with producers directly. So there's this new organization that's just come to India about a year ago, but it's called Fish Welfare Initiative. They are an animal protection group exclusively focused on fish welfare. And they are now slowly working with these collectives of fish farmers in different parts of India to help them first educate them on the basic standards of fish welfare and then secure commitments from them to say in a period of 10 years they will incrementally increase the welfare of the fish on their farms, which could run into a few million fish even, by increasing the water quality from this much to this much, by stunning the fish, and by ensuring dissolved oxygen or reducing stocking density. So direct producer outreach, that's also something that animal protection groups are exploring. And yes, so like Lou mentioned, HSI India, we recently hosted India's first roundtable on fish welfare and aquaculture. As it's a pretty nascent issue in India, we haven't actually had a roundtable like this before amongst the animal protection groups and environment protection groups. So it was really interesting. There were certain concerns, that were raised about, like, how do we even make a program intervention when there's such little information on the subject in India? So that's definitely a big gap that we have that we want to try and fix. So, and that ties into the outcome that I shared earlier about getting more peer-reviewed research on the subject. And also, how do we involve the government and how do we involve the corporate sector? So this was a really interesting panel, and the campaign interventions that I just spoke of, many of them were discussed at the roundtable. And our hope is that the roundtable is just the first of a very long and important dialogue on a very neglected issue. And I just wanted to flag here that because we're still a developing country, it's very natural that the focus for most people is human related welfare issues and social justice issues. And therefore, the challenge for animal protection groups is to sort of, how do we get the public and the government to care about these issues, which they typically see as secondary? Like, oh, we have to first deal with all the human suffering and then we'll get to the animal suffering. And within animal suffering, first the dogs and then the wild animals and then the farm animals. And we're slowly getting to talk about chickens, and fish is super back burner priority. So that's really a big challenge. But yeah, that's the reason this roundtable is a very important starting point, and it's the first time that our movement in India has met to discuss this. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you so much, and yeah, I can take questions now if there are any.
Thank you so much, Lakshmi. That was really interesting and a very detailed presentation. Now we can go to our questions. Our first question is, can you tell us a bit about the religious attitude towards fishes in India?
Um, I don't think there is any. Um, for instance, cows in India are revered as very sacred, but there's also a very confused and sometimes hypocritical relationship there, because they revere a cow as very sacred and being like the mother, but also we have the biggest dairy industry in the world and the biggest beef industry in the world and the biggest leather industry in the world. So it really is that economics outweighs any public sentiment. So that's the cow, but the fish, I don't think fish even feature as a dialogue anywhere. The welfare of fish is so, I wouldn't even say deprioritized, it's unnoticed. I don't think most people even understand that something that looks like a fish, and I think most people just see it as food, or even if they see it as an animal, there's really no emotional connect with it. They don't think it's sentient. They think it's maybe a bit slimy, and it's that there is really no emotional connection with fish, and fish welfare does not feature in any religion, so it's an unnoticed animal.
So you're saying it's unnoticed, and what made you do research on this topic?
Because we understand that the numbers are horrific, and it's even telling in the fact that we don't have numbers for individual suffering fish. When we say India is producing 12.5 million metric tons, even the way we measure it is so economic. We see it literally in million metric tons. That we don't know how many individual suffering animals are there, and fish are deeply sentient, and um, so there is very little, even within the animal protection community, we don't often have the resources to understand the issue fully, but we understand that it's an area of tremendous suffering. So it's definitely something that we have to start looking at seriously.
Mhm. Next question is, what aquatic animal is mostly used in farming in India?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, it's the major Indian carp. So the carp is the main species. About 95% of India's total aquaculture production is in three species of carp.
Mhm. Okay. What are the most cruel practices that are used in aquaculture in India?
So it's a couple. First is the stocking density. And all of this is, by the way, worsened by the fact that there is no law on the subject. There is no law on what an ideal stocking density for a particular species should be. So it's free for anyone to just dump fish together, and there is really no consequence. So the very, very high stocking densities in the fish farms, that's a huge aspect of the cruelty. And very poor water quality. Like I said, it's often like drainage water, and the fish have to live in that. And of course, the no stunning before slaughter. So they just left writhing in pain, and those videos are horrific. And where they're just sort of like turning around and they're unable to settle, and basically they're struggling to breathe out of water for hours simply because they're not stunned.
Is seafood consumption popular in India, and what attitude of the public, what attitude is towards it?
So relative to the rest of South Asia or Southeast Asia, our per capita consumption is quite low of fish, but it's and fish is also in India mostly consumed around the coast, where it's freshly available. But it's definitely increasing. And if it's a government priority to increase fish consumption, fish production in India, both for export and internal consumption, then you can make sure that even if the per capita is low, it is only set to increase in coming years.
Mhm. Okay, our last question is, are aquatic animals protected by law in theory or in practice in India? And is the legislation enforced, and how?
So, well, certain species that are not meant for consumption are protected under the Wildlife Protection Act. But that's from a conservation standpoint. Certain species are protected. Those species aren't anyway consumed for as food. But the ones that are consumed as food have absolutely no protections whatsoever. The only laws surrounding those food fish are relating to their productivity and maximizing efficiency and basically the economic aspect of it. And regarding enforcement, whatever little regulation is there for fish farms, I must say there is extremely poor enforcement. There's simply no resource at the enforcement agency level to even check on violations, let alone enforce them. So it's a free for all industry, and anything goes.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation again.